I used to have a job that was several miles away from my home. For the most part, I would ride my bike to work. It wasn't the best way of getting there because there weren't a lot of sidewalks or areas for it, but it sure as hell beat walking all the way there. About 6 years ago, I was working the closing shift. The sky had been looking rather foreboding all day long. This was my first winter working this particular job, and I hadn't thought much about how I'd get home if there was ever a snowstorm. I definitely could not ride my bike home in the snow, so I kept on hoping that oncoming snow would just wait until I got home before slamming down on us. Instead, though, it began snowing about 5 hours before my shift was over. I remember I even considered asking if I could go home early because of this, but I didn't in the end. Instead, I watched the snow fall down and kept hoping it would either stop or it wouldn't pile up so much that I couldn't get home. Of course, the snow does not listen to the whims of humans, though. About an hour before my shift was over, there was over a foot of snow on the ground already. The trucks hadn't gotten around to doing much work on it either. I knew there would be no way I would be able to ride my bike home now. Like I said, it was a few miles from my store to my apartment. I knew I would have to walk the entire way, and it would take a lot longer than a regular walk too. I'd be trudging through the snow ankle deep. It was going to be a miserable experience. I'd have to leave my bike at the store too. It's not like I could carry it there the entire way with me. Once I was out and on my way, it was even worse than I'd thought though. The wind was blowing hard, and the snow was smacking me right in the face. It was really stinging actually, and making me constantly have to close my eyes to even go forward. I tried to tell myself that I'd be happy when I got home at least, making myself a cup of hot chocolate and some tasty soup, turning up the heat and just relaxing at home. There weren't that many cars that went by, but one actually stopped and pulled up close to me. The man rolled down his window and asked me if I needed a ride. Although I wasn't really into hitchhiking, I was ecstatic at the thought of not having to walk all the way there. Of course, I accepted and jumped into the car, thanking the man over and over. This enthusiasm didn't last long, though. The man asked me where I was going, and I told him where my apartment building was situated. He started driving, and he seemed to be thinking really hard about something. Then he said the weirdest thing. "Well, that's a bit out of my way. How about you come and spend the night at my place instead?" The question surprised me. I wasn't about to do that, surely. Not to mention, my place was only 3 miles down the road. I was creeped out instantly, so I declined and inched away from the man. He seemed very perturbed, and I insisted on continuing to my apartment. It was only a few minutes away. I even offered to give him a few dollars for gas. He refused to give up, though. He kept on talking about his house and said I would be able to get a really good rest there. Even said that he had a full liquor cabinet and that I could have whatever I wanted from it. I countered by saying I didn't drink and I couldn't sleep anywhere that was not my own bed. I told him to either take me to my apartment right now or let me out so I could just walk home. The man then just kind of exploded. He got furious, started yelling and smacking all over the car, saying he should just take me all the way back to my store and make me walk back from there while he watched. How dare I accuse him of having ulterior motives? Of course, I hadn't done that in the first place. I was freaked out now though, and I surely knew he had ulterior motives. I pressed myself up against the door of the car, and that's when his anger definitely got the better of him. He slowed down. He said he was going to take me away further from my home and drop me off in the middle of the woods by myself. He pulled into the parking lot of a store in order to turn around. Luckily for me, while he was turning, he slowed down just enough I figured I could leap out of the car, and I did. I leapt out into a bank of snow and tried to run. I'd left his door open, but I was slipping on the ice. I managed to catch my feet, and pretty quickly the man started screaming at me and tried to drive after me with his door still open. I ran up to the nearby store. It was closed, but there were still workers inside. I slammed on the doors and begged someone to let me in. I was scared of the man outside. The workers rushed over and let me inside. The man drove off soon after. They offered to call the police for me, but I declined. One of the workers was even nice enough to give me a ride home for free, so I still got to have my soup and hot chocolate in the end. But I don't think I'll ever be hitchhiking again. When I was growing up, I had a really good friend named Carl. Carl and I met in kindergarten, and we hit it off pretty much immediately. Pretty soon, we were doing everything together. When we were old enough to begin having sleepovers, we would spend every other weekend at each other's house and stay up late watching movies and playing video games. Mostly, we watched television together. This happened a long time ago. I'll never forget one particular night he spent over at my house though. I think I was about 12 years old. This happened a few weeks after Christmas, and this was on a Friday night. On the way home from school, we could tell it would be an interesting night. The sky had been completely overcast all day, and it wasn't just overcast. The clouds were extremely dark, as if they seemed to be bearing down on the world. The wind was blowing very fiercely. We could tell there was one hell of a storm on its way. So this night, Carl came over to my house to spend the night. We did all sorts of the typical stuff. Sloppy Joes for dinner, watched some movies. My parents went to bed pretty early, which was quite typical for them. Carl and I always stayed up really late when we were together. It was shortly before Carl arrived at my house that the storm finally hit, and it didn't start off slowly either. The snow immediately began impacting the earth quite hard and fast. It stuck and began building up right away. Actually, it was quite cool to look at because the snowfall was so thick it was hard to even see through. It was like watching a blanket of snow in the air. We went to my room on the second floor of the house, with my bed sitting next to the window. While we were playing Swords and Serpents, we could look outside and watch this amazing storm happening out there. It had been a few hours since my parents had gone to bed. Carl was right next to the window, sitting on my bed, while I was playing a little further away. Suddenly, though, he said, "Hey, I think there's something outside there." I really didn't believe him. We always tried to scare each other, as best friends do. I just elbowed him and gave him a smirk. "No, man, I really mean it, look." I looked over him out the window. It was quite hard to see through the snow, but there was a shed in the backyard. It had a small light on its roof, and I could see the shadow of something out by that light. It seemed to be some sort of dog or something. I told him that, and he laughed, saying he knew it was a dog, but he was trying to freak me out. Carl decided he wanted to go into the backyard and check if the dog was okay. I told him that was pretty crazy because the snow had piled up pretty high already and wasn't showing any signs of stopping. He asked if he could go out and let the dog into the shed at least, seeing as how it was all alone at night in this ugly storm. I figured that at least was alright. I told him he was on his own though. I was not about to go out there in this weather. Carl put down his controller and went outside. I heard him going down the stairs and kept looking out the window, then back at the television out of the corner of my eye. I saw Carl outside moving towards the shed. I don't think he knew how hard it was going to be going over there though. I watched him very much in amusement. Yeah, he was my best friend, but who doesn't like seeing their best friend acting all silly? He walked through the yard, and I could see him a little more clearly when he made it to the shed. He began trying to pull the door open so he could let the dog in. I watched, laughing, because he hadn't noticed that it seemed the snow was making it difficult to open the door in the first place. While I was laughing at my best friend struggling though, I suddenly noticed another figure. There was a large man who had been hiding in the darkness. He quickly moved into the light of the shed and grabbed Carl. He slapped his hand over Carl's mouth, then lifted him off his feet. He pulled Carl away and into the darkness. Shocked, I immediately ran to my parents' room and began slamming on the door. My dad rushed over, and I told him what just happened. He told me to call the police and went to the closet and grabbed his gun. I called the cops and watched as my dad ran off into the darkness, out into the backyard. All I could do was wait for either the police to get there or for my dad to come back with Carl. I just kept on worrying about both Carl and my dad. All of a sudden, I heard a gunshot ring out in the night and felt my insides go cold. Right before the police finally arrived, my dad returned to the house soaking wet. He had his gun, and fortunately he had Carl with him as well. When the police arrived, my dad told them he was following the kidnapper. The man was very fast and clearly about to escape, so he fired a shot to let the guy know he was armed. That was when the man cut his losses and dropped Carl into a bank of snow. Fortunately, my best friend was okay for the most part. Neither he nor my dad ever got a good look at the guy, so he was never caught in the end. That was really hard on Carl, but he did eventually get over it. We went back to trying to beat swords and serpents. Little did we know back then that there was a bug in the game, and it was actually impossible to beat. Surely a story to tell for a long time. I used to build a snowman every year when I was a kid. It was always fun taking a small snowball, then rolling it into such a huge one. Hell, when I was done with most of my snowmen, they ended up being even bigger than I was at age 13. I recall being excited one particular night when the snow began to fall quite heavily. This excitement only escalated when I heard that school was going to be canceled the following day. This meant there was even more snowfall to be expected, and that meant I'd be able to build a killer snowman. The next day, I remember having hot cocoa and watching the snow falling from the living room window, knowing I would be having the time of my life. The following morning, yes, I was a dork and got up really early in the morning, got dressed, and ran out into the snow. I immediately sank down to my knees, but I didn't even care. I got right to work. When I was done with my snowman, I put my scarf on it and admired it. Then went inside to get a snack. While I was eating though, I noticed a guy I knew from school named Phil coming down my street. I felt a little bit alarmed because Phil was a bully from school. I watched him as he walked by. He noticed my snowman right on the edge of the yard at the sidewalk. He yanked the scarf and the hat off the snowman and started trying to reshape its head. I got up and ran outside. I screamed at him to stop it. The guy rolled up a snowball and threw it at me. It was hard and full of ice and smacked me right in the eye. My mom saw what was happening and ran outside, told Phil to get away from our yard. He gave my mom the finger and called her an old bitch. He invited her to make him get out of the yard. My mom told him, "Fine, I'll just call your mother." Then she did. Phil's mom was pissed off and promised my mom she would take care of it in the future. Phil would surely be grounded for a very long time. Satisfied, I went out and started to repair my snowman. I let myself forget all about Phil because I figured I was not going to be seeing him for quite a while. I was wrong though. The next day at school, he immediately started tormenting me, blaming me for him getting chewed out by his mom. He tried to start a fight with me, knocked me down and jumped on top of me. The principal came and broke up that fight luckily. He got suspended for a week. I figured on top of everything that had already happened, he would be in even more trouble with his mom. That night, I went to bed feeling very secure and happy, knowing this jerk would be in trouble for a long time. I woke up the next morning and immediately looked out my window at my snowman. I was terrified to see it had been vandalized overnight. Its head had been ripped off, and sitting on the ground was a large kitchen knife that had been inserted into it. The snowman was covered with blood, and written in the snow on the ground very carefully was, "You're next." Naturally, my mom saw this as well and got in contact with Phil's mom again. She said he'd actually disappeared the previous night, and she'd called the police because he never came home. I didn't see Phil ever again after, so I have no idea what happened to him. I thought he must have run off, but not knowing where he was made my life a lot worse. because I had no idea when he might decide to show up and take revenge on me, nor what he might do to me when he did. I remember my first job as a teenager. I was 16 years old and got myself a job in town. I was working in the used video game store. I got the job in the first place because I was trying to save up money to buy my first car. Obviously, this meant I had to walk to and from work every day. This happened in the late fall, so it got dark pretty early in the day. The store usually stayed open until 10 p.m., and I worked the closing shift. It wasn't too hard to get the store closed down and then get out the door very promptly. Usually, I would be out on my way around 10:30 or so. On this night, I noticed that when I left the store, it was unusually warm for this time of year. As I locked up the door, I soon discovered why. Right as I was doing so, lightning lit up the entire area. There was a storm on its way. In addition to the lightning, there was some very strong wind. Strong enough to almost blow me over more than once. It was inconvenient for walking, but actually, I kind of liked the atmospheric nature of this storm. I grew up in one of those really small towns that was pretty much all closed up by 9 p.m. This meant that by the time I was on my way, I truly felt very alone. To get to my house, I had to walk through town, then take a turn into an old neighborhood. There weren't many houses there. Most of them had been torn down long before I was even born. There was a large wooded area on the left side of the street. There were no street lamps either, so it was very, very dark in the woods. I have to admit that several times, I was very nervous as I was walking by that area. The stormy night obviously didn't make it any better. It hadn't started raining yet, but I had just been witness to an amazing lightning show while walking home. The wind was so loud and hard too, it had to be blowing over 20 miles per hour. Despite the loud blowing of the wind though, I could have sworn at one point I began to hear someone walking in the wooded area alongside me. Now that was very scary. I wasn't one to really be scared of much usually. I tried to tell myself it was just an animal, but that was hardly comforting. Even if it was an animal, it seemed to be very intent on following me along the street. You know how you convince yourself there's something happening, even if it really isn't, and when you do this, you become very preoccupied with the thought of it. Then it snowballs into a nerve-wracking episode? Well, that's exactly what was happening to me. I knew it was too. I kept on glancing over at the woods, but finally my fears were realized when one of those area-brightening bolts of lightning lit up the entire woods. In that moment, I saw a man standing half-hidden behind one of the trees, holding what looked like a baseball bat. It was a quick flash of light. All that I saw was an outline after the lightning crack. Somehow, it seemed it was even darker than it was before it. I felt a twinge of pain in my eyes and had to squint when the thunder stopped rolling. I then distinctly heard the sounds of footsteps on the pavement in the dark. I felt freaked out. Anyone would have. I ran down the street at top speed. The entire time, I could hear the footsteps of the man coming after me. That just spurred me on to run faster. I sprinted down onto my street and was delighted to see the living room light on my house was on. That meant someone was up still. I ran to the house and grabbed the doorknob. I was fully expecting to be grabbed from behind when I held it. However, I was able to get into the house and close and lock the door behind me before anything happened. My little brother was sitting there on the couch, and I told him to call the police right away. I looked out the door window, and at first I didn't see anything. There was another bolt of lightning though, and I could see the shadow of the man standing in the middle of the street just in front of my house, looking inside. By the time the next flash of lightning shot down, he was already gone. I don't know who he was or what he wanted. I figure though he couldn't have been after me specifically. He was probably after anyone who happened to be walking along that street in the dark, but it really scared me half to death that night.